paradox of omnipotence questions whether we can say that God is really all-powerful, or whether that concept is itself contradictory, such that it's impossible to be all-powerful in the way we want to say it is. So, is there a limitation on God's power? Is God all-powerful? Does that even make sense? Now, you might already be thinking of the irresistible force paradox, because one of the ways in which we hear about this one, the paradox of omnipotence, is the question, can God create a rock so big that he himself could not lift it? Or if you watch The Simpsons, you wonder if God can heat a burrito so hot that he himself could not eat it. And this has been a problem in the history of philosophy that people take seriously, and there are some prescribed solutions, and it depends on what we think counts among the possible things, and then among those, the possible things that we think God should be able to do. So, in your reading, I specify all of the objections that Aquinas points out for whether or not we can even conceive of God as being all-powerful. Let's go over a few of them. One of them uses the concept of potentiality. Now remember that we have potentials that are both active and passive, and when I say that I have a potential to hit people, that's an activity of mine, but I have a corresponding potentiality to be hit, and that's part of my potentiality as well. Something of a different nature might not necessarily be able to get punched. Now, when we think about God, is it important for God to have passive potentiality? When what I mean by that is just the fact that I have the capacity to get punched by roving bandits, but God does not, right? So that seems to be something that I can do, but God can't, and therefore God doesn't have the power to get punched like I do. And that's Aquinas' first possible objection to the idea that God is omnipotent, the idea that God cannot be moved or suffer. I can, though. So shouldn't God have that capacity if God is really all-powerful? Aquinas' answer is to exclude these passive potentialities from what counts as a power, or at least not the kind that we need to attribute to God in order to call God all-powerful. So objection 1 is God can't be passive. Objection 2, focus on some other active potentialities that I seem to have that God doesn't. Specifically, I have the capacities to lie, cheat, murder, and steal, and God does not. If it is in God's nature not to sin, then isn't that a limitation on God's power? I mean, shouldn't God be powerful enough that he could cheat, lie, murder, and steal if he wanted to? Because otherwise, it seems that, again, I can do something that God can't. And this isn't just the capacity to get punched by people. This is the capacity to do something. One of those active potentialities that God is supposed to have. What do we do about that? The third objection is a biblical one, which we don't tend to focus on in philosophy because it deals with the biblical text as opposed to the reasonable arguments we prefer. The third objection is just that the Bible says that to spare and have mercy is very powerful, a very powerful thing for God to do, and yet we think of other things as being more powerful. So we'll mention that and then move on. The fourth objection is heavy on the logic. focusing on the idea of God's powers. The powers have to appeal to everything that is possible, right? Because you can only do things that are possible. But what about the impossible? If it is true that God is all-powerful, then it should be logically true to say that, for God at least, nothing is impossible. But at the same time, we want to believe that some things are necessary in the world. And if you eliminate the idea that anything is impossible, then the concept of necessity also has to go with it. And by necessity, we mean things that are logically true, that were they not true would result in a logical contradiction. Don't let those words scare you. We mean things like, it is logically true that any three-sided shape has three interior angles. We're talking about a triangle, and if it has three sides, it has three inner corners, and that's a necessary truth on this kind of account. It is necessarily true that 2 + 2 = 4 because of the definitions of 2 and the definition of plus and the definition of 4 and what the equal sign means. That's the kind of necessity we're talking about. Now, if God could be thought to defy even those basic logical principles, then maybe we could say that nothing is impossible. But Aquinas' solution wants us to keep those. Aquinas wants us to be able to keep those necessary truths, but not conceiving of them as a limitation on God's power. So, let's use a concrete example, one that is really common in the history of philosophy, which is the idea of a square circle. It's the ultimate example of something that is impossible. It is impossible to make a square circle. And it's because of the definitions of these terms. So it's really easy to see what the impossibility is here. You cannot make a square circle because one of them has 4 sides and one of them has like 1 side. And you can't have something that is both 4-sided and 1-sided at the same time. Those ideas contradict each other. So the reason you can't have square circles is because the ideas don't fit together. So it's a logical impossibility. There's no such thing as a 4-sided, 1-sided plane figure. Now, if we were trying to contradict Aquinas here, we would say, okay, but that counts as a limitation. I mean, if you want your God to be all-powerful, then I want that God to make me a square circle. I think that should be possible for something that is all-powerful, to which all possibilities could be enacted. If God really is all-powerful, why should God be bound by the rules of logic, right? Why should God be bound by the definitions of squares? And Aquinas uses this kind of argument to try and respond to all of the other earlier objections. So, if we define God as an active thing that can't sin, and if this is our definition of what God is to start with, then it's not a limitation of God to say that He's an active thing that can't sin. It's just what God is. So to try and make this demand of our God thing to say that it's passive and can sin makes the same kind of contradiction as appears in the square circle. Or to spell it out, the idea of a sinful God is as internally contradictory as the square circle. The concepts don't go together. And the same for a passive God and a God that doesn't spare people. So to recap, the omnipotence paradox is about the concept that God is all-powerful, and whether any limitation whatsoever on that power should negate the idea that God is all-powerful. Aquinas' theory is that God can exist and have these limitations, and as long as they are logical contradictions, then that's fine. These things, these limitations on God's power barely count, right? They're not real limitations. On the other hand, if God is bound by the rules of logic, then that seems to put logic above God. On the other hand, again, if God created the rules of logic, then God is only bound by himself. And the question is whether it even makes sense for something to be all-powerful, given what the word actually entails.